The fluorescent lights of Lincoln High School buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Ava Harper clutched her worn backpack straps, watching the familiar scene unfold before her. Rain streaked the cafeteria windows, creating rivers of distortion that seemed to mirror the twisted faces of her classmates. Ashley Bennett's perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at her, while the circle of designer-clad students erupted in laughter that felt sharp enough to cut glass. "Look at St. Ava." Ashley's voice dripped with venom, probably dreaming about her homeless boyfriend again. The sandwich in Ava's brown paper bag, 2 slices of day-old bread wrapped around thin ham, suddenly felt like a brick in her hands. Her grandmother's worried face flashed in her mind, counting coins at the kitchen table just that morning, and Ava's stomach twisted with a familiar cocktail of shame and defiance. Outside, through the rain-soaked window, she could see him, the elderly man in the threadbare coat sitting on the bench by the school gates, shoulders hunched against the Chicago wind. The mockery had started 3 months ago when Ava first noticed the man during her lunch break. His weathered hands shook as he tried to shield himself from the autumn rain, and something in his distant eyes reminded her painfully of her mother's expression during those final hospital visits. While other students hurried past phones glued to their ears, Ava had approached with half her sandwich and a shy smile. "Feeding strays now, Harper." Kevin Matthews had sneered from behind her. "What's next, bringing him home to meet Abuela?" The laughter that followed felt like acid on her skin. But the gentle gratitude in the old man's eyes had made every cruel word worth enduring. Each day since she'd saved part of her meager lunch, ignoring the increasingly creative insults that followed her through the hallways. Her classmates seemed to compete for the most cutting remarks, their cruelty sharpened by boredom and privilege that Ava couldn't fathom. The social exile had become complete by November. Birthday invitations that never came, group projects, where her name was reluctantly added, last whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Ava had learned to navigate Lincoln High like a ghost. Her only solace came during those brief moments by the school gates, sharing simple meals with the stranger who never asked for her name, but always thanked her with quiet dignity. "You don't have to do this," he'd said once, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against her chest. But Ava understood loneliness in ways her privileged classmates never could. Her grandmother worked double shifts at the hospital. Her mother was 3 years buried, and home felt more like a waiting room than a sanctuary. The old man's gratitude filled a hollow space inside her that she hadn't even realized existed. Winter arrived early that year, coating Chicago in a layer of ice that made everything look beautiful and treacherous. Ava's classmates had upgraded from verbal cruelty to digital warfare, creating group chats specifically to mock her daily ritual of feeding the vagrant. Screenshots of her approaching the bench circulated like currency among the popular crowd, each image accompanied by increasingly elaborate captions that painted her as either desperately pathetic or dangerously delusional. "Maybe she thinks he's secretly rich," someone had posted, like in those stupid movies her kind watches. The phrase "her kind" had stung more than Ava expected, carrying implications that went far beyond her family's financial struggles. During fourth period, Mrs. Patterson had pulled her aside with a concerned expression that somehow managed to make Ava feel smaller than any insult ever could. "Some parents have expressed concerns about your interactions with the homeless individual," the guidance counselor said carefully. "Perhaps it would be best if you ate lunch in the library instead." Ava nodded silently, but her feet still carried her to the gates every day, defiance burning in her chest like a small, fierce flame. The breaking point came on a Thursday that felt like the end of the world. Ava had forgotten her umbrella, and the December rain soaked through her thin jacket as she hurried toward the school gates with a bag containing 2 empanadas her grandmother had made. The warm mesa steamed when she opened the container, and the old man's face lit up with a joy that made Ava's heart ache. His fingers, blue with cold, brushed against hers as he accepted the food, and for a moment the school's cruelty felt far away. That's when she heard the camera click. Ava spun around to see Jessica Palmer, holding up her phone, grinning like a predator who just cornered her prey. "This is going to be perfect," Jessica announced to her gathered friends. "Wait until everyone Sees our little charity case playing house with her pet hobo. The photo appeared online within minutes, shared across every social media platform Lincoln High students used, captioned with words so cruel that Ava's hands shook as she read them. By the time she reached her next class, the entire school seemed to be whispering her name, and not one word she caught was kind. But what happens when the object of everyone's mockery holds a secret that could shatter their world? What happens when kindness, battered and bruised by cruelty, finally finds its voice? That night, Ava cried into her pillow until her grandmother's gentle knock interrupted the storm of her grief. "Mija," Abuela's voice carried decades of wisdom earned through hardship. "Some people throw stones because they've forgotten what it feels like to build something beautiful." But the words felt hollow against the weight of her humiliation. The online post had spread beyond Lincoln High, shared by students from neighboring schools who didn't even know her name but found entertainment in her pain. Comments ranged from merely mean to genuinely disturbing, suggesting everything from mental illness to hidden motives that made Ava's skin crawl. She'd closed her laptop after reading a particularly vicious thread about charity cases who think they're saints. But the words followed her into sleep, where they twisted into nightmares that left her waking, gasping and small. The aftermath proved worse than the initial attack. Students who had previously ignored Ava now actively avoided her as if her kindness were contagious and shameful. Teachers began watching her with expressions caught between pity and suspicion, and Ava realized that her simple act of human decency had somehow marked her as dangerous. The old man seemed to sense her distress during their next encounter, his weathered features creasing with concern as she approached with obvious reluctance. "The world chews kindness and spits it out, Nina," he said quietly, pressing something small and smooth into her palm. It was a stone, pale and perfectly rounded worm from his pocket. But one day, his eyes held a light that seemed to pierce through Ava's despair. "Kindness grows teeth." She didn't understand what he meant, but the weight of the stone in her hand felt like a promise of something she couldn't yet name. Have you ever stood up for someone when everyone else turned their backs, even when it cost you everything? Share your story in the comments below. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of whispered insults and deliberate isolation. Ava had become Lincoln High's favorite cautionary tale, the girl whose misguided compassion had made her a laughingstock. Her grades began to slip, as concentration became impossible in classrooms where every glance felt loaded with judgment. The old man's condition seemed to worsen with the deepening winter, his cough echoing wetly in the morning air, but Ava's visits became more furtive and brief. She couldn't bear to give her tormentors fresh ammunition, yet abandoning him entirely felt like betraying the last honest relationship in her life. The stone he'd given her became a talisman that she rubbed smooth with anxious fingers its surface, warming under her touch during the coldest moments of each day. At home, her grandmother's concerned glances grew more frequent, but Ava couldn't find words to explain how helping one person had somehow made her the villain in everyone else's story. February arrived like a judgment-gray and unforgiving coating Chicago in slush that reflected the sky's indifference. Ava had almost convinced herself that senior year couldn't possibly get worse when the impossible happened. Something that would transform not just her story, but her understanding of who she really was. The morning started like any other, with Ashley Bennett's crowd clustered near the main entrance, their laughter sharp enough to cut through the winter air. Ava kept her head down, clutching her backpack straps like armor when the sound reached them, a low, thrumming roar that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Students began running toward the windows, voices rising in confusion and excitement. "Is that thunder?" someone shouted, but the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The sound grew louder, more focused, until it became unmistakably mechanical. Through the tall windows of Lincoln High, Ava watched in stunned silence as a sleek, private jet descended toward the school's athletic field, its landing gear extending like the talons of some magnificent bird of prey. But who could possibly arrive in such dramatic fashion, and why would they come to Lincoln High? The jet touched down on the football field with surprising grace, its engines winding down as emergency vehicles raced across the grounds. "Principal," Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom, barely maintaining professional composure, as he announced an unexpected but authorized landing, and urged students to remain calm. But calm was impossible, as they pressed against windows recording everything on their phones. Speculation flying faster than the aircraft that had just transformed their ordinary Thursday into something extraordinary. Ava found herself pushed toward the front of the crowd by students suddenly eager to include her in their excitement, their previous cruelty temporarily forgotten in the face of genuine mystery. The jet's door opened with mechanical precision, and a figure emerged, tall, impeccably dressed, moving with the kind of confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to scan the crowd with specific purpose. When his gaze found Ava through the window, she felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that defied explanation. The man walked directly toward the school's main entrance, with steps that suggested he knew exactly where he was going and why. Students parted before him like water, their phones capturing every moment as he approached the administrative offices. Within minutes, Ava found herself summoned to the principal's office, her legs trembling as she navigated hallways filled with staring faces and whispered speculation. The man stood when she entered, his expression unreadable, but somehow gentle, and Ava noticed that he held something in his closed fist. "You're Ava Harper," he said, and it wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to find her voice, as he opened his hand to reveal the stone. Her stone, the one the old man had given her somehow, polished to an even brighter sheen. "He told me about you before he passed," the man continued, his voice catching slightly on the words. "About the girl who saw him when everyone else looked away." The revelation hit Ava like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees buckle. The old man, her friend, her daily reminder that kindness still existed in the world, was gone. But before she could process the grief, the stranger continued speaking, his words reshaping everything she thought she knew about the man she'd tried to help. "My name is David Morrison," he said, and Ava recognized the surname of a business empire that owned half of downtown Chicago. "He was my father. He disappeared 23 years ago after my mother died, lost himself to grief and guilt, until we all believed he was dead." David's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "But you saw him. You fed him. You gave him the dignity that his own son couldn't provide because I was too proud to keep looking." The weight of this revelation settled over Ava like a blanket, warm and heavy and impossible to fully comprehend. The homeless man who had become her anchor in a sea of cruelty had been carrying his own enormous burden of loss and isolation. The final moment of Ava's transformation arrived not with fanfare but with a quiet exchange that changed everything. David Morrison reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, thick and official, with Ava's name written across the front in elegant script. "This is a full scholarship to Northwestern University," he said simply, "with a stipend for living expenses and a guarantee of internship placement at Morrison Industries upon graduation." Ava's hands shook as she accepted the envelope, its weight somehow representing all the dreams she'd never dared to voice. But David wasn't finished. "There's something else," he continued, reaching for a second envelope. "My father left instructions for a foundation to be established in his name, dedicated to supporting programs for the homeless in Chicago. He wanted you to serve on the board of directors to help ensure that people like him never go unseen again." The magnitude of this opportunity, to transform her small acts of kindness into something systemic and lasting, left Ava speechless. The girl who had been mocked for caring too much was now being entrusted with the power to change countless lives. As David Morrison prepared to leave, he paused at the office door and looked back at Ava, with an expression that seemed to encompass gratitude, respect, and something approaching awe. "While your classmates were busy tearing you down for showing compassion," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hallway, where students still lingered in curious clusters, "you were doing something extraordinary. You saw my father as a human being worthy of dignity and care. That's not common, Ava. That's rare and precious and exactly what this world needs more of." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He told me once that kindness isn't weakness. It's strength that most people are too afraid to show. You weren't afraid." The words hung in the air like a benediction, as David Morrison walked back toward his waiting jet, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence, and a young woman whose life had just been transformed by the very qualities her tormentors had tried to destroy. Ava stood in the doorway envelope, clutched to her chest, watching the man who had just validated every moment of mockery she'd endured for the sake of simple human kindness. The months that followed passed like a dream, punctuated by moments of startling clarity. Ava's acceptance to Northwestern became the talk of Lincoln High, but the conversations now carried notes of admiration rather than derision. Her former tormentors found themselves suddenly eager to claim friendship with the girl they'd spent months trying to destroy their social calculations, adjusting rapidly to accommodate her new status. But Ava had learned something profound about the nature of genuine connection during those lonely months of persecution. She no longer needed their approval or acceptance. The scholarship David Morrison had provided came with something even more valuable than financial security, the knowledge that her capacity for compassion was not a weakness to be hidden, but a strength to be celebrated and cultivated. When she walked across the stage at graduation, Ava carried the smooth stone in her pocket, a reminder of the man whose hidden story had ultimately revealed her own true worth. Years later, as Dr. Ava Harper stood before the City Council, proposing expanded funding for Chicago's homeless outreach programs, she would often touch that stone in her pocket and remember the lesson her old friend had taught her. Kindness, she had learned, doesn't always receive immediate recognition or reward. Sometimes it requires enduring mockery, isolation, and the painful weight of being misunderstood by people too small to see beyond their own prejudices. But when kindness finally finds its voice, when it grows those teeth her friend had promised, it can transform not just individual lives but entire communities. The foundation bearing his name had already opened 3 new shelters and funded mental health services for hundreds of Chicago's most vulnerable residents. Each person helped was a testament to the truth that simple human decency practiced consistently, despite opposition, has the power to create ripples that extend far beyond any single act of compassion. The girl who had once been mocked for feeding a stranger had become a woman whose kindness had literally grown teeth, sharp enough to bite through systemic indifference, strong enough to build lasting change, and wise enough to remember that every act of genuine care carries within it the seeds of transformation. Ava never forgot that private jet landing on Lincoln High's football field, but more importantly, she never forgot the quiet dignity of the man on the bench who had seen something worth nurturing in a lonely teenager's simple desire to share her lunch. Sometimes the greatest victories begin with the smallest gestures, and sometimes the people who laugh loudest at compassion are simply afraid of what the world might look like if everyone had the courage to care as deeply as that mocked girl who kept feeding strangers one sandwich at a time. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.